Ezra Blackwood froze mid-step on his porch, the morning coffee mug slipping from his weathered hands as he watched the 17-year-old girl collapse to her knees in his kitchen. Annie Ruth Calloway wasn't just crying, she was cradling her 7-month pregnant belly like a shield, whispering, "They're coming for my baby," over and over. The porcelain shattered against the wooden floor, echoing through the Montana Valley silence. Mrs. Henderson's scream from the neighboring ranch cut through the crisp September air as she witnessed the scene through the window. Ezra's throat tightened, his mind racing back 7 years to another morning, another girl's tears, his daughter Emma, who'd vanished without a trace at age 8. Annie had the same emerald eyes, the same star-shaped scar on her right shoulder that he'd glimpsed when she reached for tissues. "Get inside. Lock the doors," he commanded, his Navy SEAL instincts overriding the tremor in his voice. What evil had followed this child to his doorstep, and why did every fiber of his being scream that his 7-year nightmare was about to end? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. The Sweetwater Valley stretched endlessly under the September sky, golden wheat fields rippling like an ocean frozen in time. Ezra Blackwood's 800-acre cattle ranch sat in the heart of this Montana paradise, a testament to 30 years of backbreaking labor and unwavering determination. At 61, his hands bore the permanent stains of honest work, calloused palms that had built every fence post, mended every gate, and carried every burden this land had thrown at him. The ranch house itself told the story of a man who'd once believed in forever. Built in 1975 for his bride Sarah, every beam had been placed with the careful attention of a man planning for generations. The wraparound porch where Sarah used to shell peas still creaked in the same spots. Her flower garden, now wild and overgrown, remained untouched, a shrine to the woman who'd filled these rooms with laughter until cancer stole her voice in 1994. But it was the small bedroom at the end of the hall that revealed the true depth of Ezra's heartbreak. Emma's room remained exactly as she'd left it 7 years ago, pink bedspread neatly tucked, stuffed animals arranged on the window seat, a half-finished puzzle of Montana wildflowers still scattered across the desk. The music box that played "You Are My Sunshine" sat silent on the dresser, its melody too painful for Ezra to bear. Each morning for 7 years, Ezra had followed the same ritual. Rise at 4, check the cattle, return for coffee at the kitchen table where he'd built 2 chairs, one for him, one for Sarah's memory. He'd speak to her photograph propped against the sugar bowl, sharing the day's plans and the weight of his solitude. "Still looking for our little girl," he'd whisper, his voice cracking with the repetition of hope that felt increasingly hollow. The isolation of Sweetwater Valley had become both blessing and curse. 45 minutes from the nearest town of Cedar Ridge, the ranch provided the perfect sanctuary for a man who'd grown tired of pitying glances and well-meaning questions about moving on. But it also meant that when Annie Ruth Calloway had appeared 3 months ago, desperate for work and shelter, she'd become the first human voice to regularly fill his home since Sarah's death. Annie was a puzzle wrapped in mystery. At 17, she carried herself with the wariness of someone far older, her pale blue eyes constantly scanning for threats that seemed to exist only in her mind. She'd arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and a story about running from an abusive situation down south. Ezra hadn't pressed for details. In his experience, people who needed help usually needed it without questions. What struck him most was her gentleness with the injured animals he sometimes brought to the house. She'd tend to orphaned calves with the natural instinct of someone born to nurture, humming melodies that seemed hauntingly familiar. Sometimes, Watching her move through Sarah's kitchen with unconscious familiarity, Ezra felt the strangest sensation, as if his house was remembering something his heart had forgotten. The morning of September 15th started like any other, until it didn't. Ezra had returned from his dawn cattle check to find the kitchen empty, Annie's usual cheerful humming replaced by an unsettling silence. He'd poured his coffee and settled into his chair, preparing for his daily conversation with Sarah's photograph, when he heard it, the soft, broken sound of someone trying not to cry. He found Annie at the kitchen table, her shoulders shaking as she clutched a letter against her chest. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated her face, revealing tears that spoke of terror rather than sadness. Her 7-month pregnancy was impossible to hide now, the curve of her belly straining against the simple dress she wore. But it was the letter in her trembling hands that made Ezra's blood run cold. The letterhead bore an ornate logo, Graceland Children's Haven, with an angel's wings spreading beneath flowing script. Even from across the room, Ezra could see the official seal, the kind of formal correspondence that carried weight and consequence. Annie's knuckles were white where she gripped the paper, and when she finally looked up at him, her eyes held the wild panic of a cornered animal. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the kitchen clock. "They're coming for my baby." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He moved closer, his rancher's instincts telling him to approach slowly, the way he would a spooked horse. "Who's coming, Annie? What does that letter say?" Her hands shook as she smoothed the paper against the table. It says final arrangements have been confirmed. Pickup is scheduled for September 20th. She looked up at him with eyes that reminded him painfully of Emma's, the same shade of green, the same long lashes that Sarah used to say were wasted on a little girl. "They're coming to take my baby away from me." Ezra felt the familiar rage that had sustained him through 7 years of searching for Emma. "Over my dead body," he said, the words coming out with the quiet certainty of a man who'd faced down enemy fire and lived to tell about it. "Tell me everything, Annie. Start from the beginning." The story that poured out of her was worse than anything Ezra could have imagined. Graceland Children's Haven wasn't an orphanage, it was something far more sinister. Young girls, most of them teenagers from broken homes or abusive situations, were brought to the facility under the guise of receiving help and education. Instead, they were systematically impregnated, and their babies sold to wealthy families who paid astronomical sums for healthy newborns. "They told us we were helping families who couldn't have children of their own," Annie said, her voice growing stronger as the truth spilled out. "They said it was God's work, that we were blessed to be able to give such a precious gift. But I heard them talking one night. They called us breeding stock. They said my baby would bring $75,000 because of my blood type and because I'm smart." Ezra's military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but listening to Annie's story tested every ounce of his self-control. "How did you get away?" "I've been planning it for months. Was a girl there, named Mary Beth. She tried to run when she was 8 months along." Annie's voice dropped to a whisper. "They brought her back. Said she fell down some stairs, but we all knew better. She died giving birth the next day, and they told the family who'd paid for her baby that there had been complications." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Annie's ragged breathing. Ezra studied her face, noting details he'd tried not to see before. The way she unconsciously hummed while working, melodies that sounded like lullabies Sarah used to sing to Emma, the left-handed way she stirred coffee just like his daughter. The small habits that seemed too familiar to be coincidence. "Annie," he said carefully, "where did they tell you that you came from? What do you remember about your life before Graceland?" She frowned. pressing her fingers to her temples as if trying to coax memories from hiding. They said my parents died in a car accident when I was little, said I was traumatized and blocked out the memories. They gave me this new name, said it would help me start fresh. Her voice grew uncertain. But sometimes I have dreams about a man with kind eyes who used to take me fishing, and a woman who smelled like vanilla and sang while she cooked. Ezra's heart stopped. Sarah had always worn vanilla perfume, and she'd sung constantly while preparing meals. And those fishing trips to the pond behind the barn, Emma had loved those Saturday mornings more than anything. The phone rang, shattering the moment. Annie jumped as if she'd been shot, her face draining of all color. Ezra answered on the third ring, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "Miss Calloway," came a cold male voice from the other end. "You have 5 days to come home voluntarily. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The phone call changed everything. As soon as Ezra hung up, he knew they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple custody dispute. The voice on the other end had carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted, regardless of who got hurt in the process. Annie's reaction confirmed his worst fears. She'd gone completely white, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. "They found me," she whispered, one hand protectively covering her belly. "I thought I had more time. I thought maybe they'd just let me go." Ezra moved to the window, scanning the horizon with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years watching for threats. The valley stretched empty in all directions, but he knew that wouldn't last long. "Pack whatever you need," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded respect from Navy SEALs half his age. "We're not waiting around for them to come calling," but Annie shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You don't understand, Mr. Blackwood. These people, they have connections. Police, judges, politicians, they've been doing this for years, and nobody stops them because nobody believes it's really happening. Who's going to believe that a respected religious organization is actually trafficking babies?" That evening, Ezra made a phone call he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Jake Morrison had served alongside him in Vietnam, and after the war Jake had joined the FBI while Ezra had chosen the quieter life of a Montana rancher. They'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, but their friendship had strained after Emma's disappearance when Jake had been forced to tell Ezra that the federal investigation had gone cold. "Jake, it's Ezra Blackwood," he said when his old friend answered. "I need your help, and I need it fast." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Jake listened without interruption as Ezra explained about Annie, about Graceland Children's Haven, and about the growing suspicion that was eating away at his sanity. When he finished, Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Jesus, Ezra," Jake finally said. "We've been tracking rumors about religious adoption fraud for months, but we've never had a witness willing to come forward. Most of these girls are too scared to talk, and the ones who do try usually disappear before they can testify." "What about Emma?" Ezra asked, the question that had haunted him for 7 years finally finding voice. Could she have been taken by the same people? "It's possible," Jake admitted. "The timeline fits, and the methods match what we've been hearing about. But Ezra, you need to understand, even if this girl is connected to Emma's case, even if she's telling the truth about everything, this is going to be dangerous. These people have killed to protect their operation." The next morning brought an unwelcome visitor. Deputy Marshal Clay Davidson arrived unannounced, his patrol car kicking up dust clouds as it wound down the ranch's long driveway. Ezra watched from the kitchen window as Davidson approached the house with the swagger of a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. "Morning, Blackwood," Davidson said as Ezra stepped onto the porch. "Mind if I come in? Got some questions about your new employee." There was something in Davidson's tone that set off every alarm bell in Ezra's head. The deputy's eyes were too knowing, his smile too confident. This wasn't a routine welfare check. This was a threat wrapped in the authority of law enforcement. "Annie's resting," Ezra said, not moving from the doorway. "Pregnancy's been hard on her." Davidson's smile widened. "I'm sure it has. Must be difficult being so far along and all alone in the world. Lucky thing she found someone willing to take her in." His eyes swept over the ranch with obvious familiarity. "Nice spread you got here, Blackwood. Be a shame if something happened to disrupt your quiet life." The menace in his words was unmistakable. Ezra felt his hands clench into fists, 30 years of military discipline warring with the protective rage that threatened to consume him. "Is there something specific you need, Deputy?" "Just wanted to make sure Miss Calloway knows she's got friends looking out for her," Davidson said. "People who care about her welfare, people who might be concerned if she suddenly disappeared." After Davidson left, Ezra found Annie huddled in Emma's room, sitting on the bed and clutching one of his daughter's stuffed animals. The sight stopped him cold, not just because of the obvious violation of the space he'd kept sacred for 7 years, but because of how natural she looked there, as if she belonged. "I'm sorry," Annie said, noticing his expression. "I don't know why I came in here. I felt safe." Ezra sat down beside her, studying her profile in the afternoon light streaming through Emma's window. "Annie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. Do you remember anything about your life before Graceland? Anything at all?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking the stuffed bear's worn fur. "Sometimes I have dreams," she said finally, "about a big man with gentle hands who taught me to fish, about a woman who sang while she cooked, who smelled like vanilla and always made sure my bedroom door was cracked open so I wouldn't be afraid of the dark." Ezra's breath caught in his throat. Sarah had indeed always left Emma's door slightly open, and vanilla had been her signature scent. "What else?" "There was a song," Annie continued, her voice growing distant. "Something about sunshine, and a music box that played it. I can almost hear it sometimes, when I'm falling asleep." Without a word, Ezra reached across her to the dresser and wound up the music box he hadn't touched in 7 years. The delicate melody of "You Are My Sunshine" filled the room, and Annie's reaction was immediate and devastating. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I know this song," she whispered. "I know every note." The music box revelation shattered something inside both of them. Annie stared at the delicate porcelain ballerina spinning to Sarah's favorite melody, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and a dawning horror that made Ezra's chest tighten with equal parts hope and dread. This wasn't coincidence. Too many pieces were falling into place with the terrible precision of a nightmare finally making sense. Over the next 2 days, Ezra watched Annie with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for 7 years. Every gesture, every unconscious habit, every fleeting expression seemed to echo memories of the daughter he'd lost. She arranged items on the kitchen counter in the exact same order Emma had preferred. She hummed while washing dishes, the same off-key but enthusiastic melodies that had once filled their home with joy. Most telling of all, she moved through the house with an unconscious familiarity that spoke of muscle memory rather than recent acquaintance. Mrs. Ida May Henderson noticed it too. The 72-year-old widow had been bringing fresh baked goods to the ranch every few days since Annie's arrival, her maternal instincts drawn to the vulnerable young woman like iron filings to a magnet. Ida May had been Sarah's closest friend and had mourned Emma's disappearance as if she'd lost her own granddaughter. "Ezra," she said quietly as they stood on the porch watching Annie hang laundry on the line behind the house, "that child moves just like Sarah did when she was pregnant with Emma. Same way of favoring her left side, same protective hand over her belly. But it was more than physical mannerisms. Ida May had brought over a photo album filled with pictures of Emma, hoping to trigger more memories, and Annie's reactions had been immediate and visceral. When she saw a photo of 8-year-old Emma grinning gap-toothed beside a massive pumpkin, Annie had touched her own front teeth unconsciously, the same teeth that had been knocked loose in the accident that had left Emma with her distinctive scar. "I remember this," Annie had whispered, her finger tracing the image. "I remember the taste of pumpkin pie and someone lifting me up to see inside the jack-o'-lantern we carved." Her voice had broken then. Why do I remember things that aren't mine to remember? The investigation that Ezra launched with Jake Morrison's help began to uncover a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single corrupt children's home. Graceland Children's Haven was part of a network spanning 8 states, all operating under the guise of religious charity while systematically trafficking children to wealthy buyers who saw nothing wrong with purchasing the family they desired. Francis Whitmore, the man who ran Graceland, had a carefully constructed public persona as a devoted minister who dedicated his life to caring for society's most vulnerable children. But the deeper Jake dug, the darker the truth became. Whitmore had lost his own son 12 years earlier in a drowning accident, a tragedy that had shattered his marriage and sent him spiraling into a twisted theology that justified taking children from families he deemed unworthy and placing them with those who could properly provide. "He's not a monster in his own mind," Jake explained during one of his frequent check-ins with Ezra. "He genuinely believes he's saving these kids. The psychological profile suggests he sees himself as an instrument of divine will, correcting God's mistakes in child placement." But it was Deputy Davidson's involvement that made the situation truly dangerous. The corrupt lawman had been on Graceland's payroll for years, using his position to obstruct investigations and silence potential witnesses. Davidson had been the responding officer when Emma first disappeared, and now Ezra understood why the case had been so quickly relegated to the cold case files. The breakthrough came when Annie's labor began prematurely on the morning of September 19th, a full day earlier than expected. Ezra had been checking the cattle when he heard her cry out from the house, a sound of pain and terror that sent him running faster than his 61-year-old legs had moved in years. He found her doubled over in the kitchen, one hand gripping the counter while the other cradled her belly. "It's too soon," she gasped between contractions. "The baby isn't supposed to come yet." Ida May arrived within minutes of Ezra's frantic phone call, her decades of experience helping with ranch births making her the closest thing to medical expertise they had access to. But as she examined Annie, her expression grew increasingly worried. "This isn't normal labor," she murmured to Ezra when Annie was between contractions. "Something's wrong. We need to get her to a hospital." That's when they discovered the real horror of Graceland's operation. Hidden in Annie's belongings, Ida May found a small vial of medication with instructions to administer it when labor begins. The drug was designed to accelerate contractions and ensure rapid delivery, a way to complete the transaction as quickly as possible while minimizing the risk of the mother changing her mind. "They drugged her," Ezra said, his voice shaking with rage as he read the label. "They've been drugging her for weeks to control when the baby comes." The premature labor was a side effect of the medication, and as Annie's contractions intensified, it became clear that they were running out of time. But it wasn't just the medical emergency that had Ezra's nerves on edge. It was the black SUVs he could see in the distance, crawling up the ranch's long driveway like predators closing in on wounded prey. Francis Whitmore had arrived a day early, bringing Deputy Davidson and 4 other men whose cold eyes and careful movements screamed of military training gone wrong. They'd come to collect their merchandise, and they clearly had no intention of leaving empty-handed. Annie's scream from the bedroom where Ida May was helping her through labor coincided perfectly with the sound of car doors slamming outside. Ezra found himself caught between two crises, his daughter giving birth upstairs and armed men surrounding his home below. "Mr. Blackwood," Francis Whitmore called from the front yard, his voice carrying the false warmth of a practiced manipulator. "We've come to help Miss Calloway through this difficult time. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Ezra stepped onto his porch, his hunting rifle held casually but unmistakably ready. "She's not going anywhere with you." Whitmore's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation. Miss Calloway is one of our girls, and the child she's carrying has already been placed with a loving family. We have all the proper paperwork." "Your paperwork isn't worth the paper it's printed on," Ezra replied. "This is my property, and that girl is under my protection." It was Deputy Davidson who escalated the situation, his hand moving toward his service weapon with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Blackwood, you're interfering with official business. Stand down or face federal charges for obstruction." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for Annie's voice calling weakly from the bedroom window above. "Papa?" she said, the word carrying clearly across the tense silence. "Papa? Is that you?" Every head turned upward, but it was Whitmore's reaction that told Ezra everything he needed to know. The minister's face went white with shock, his carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time. "That's impossible," Whitmore whispered. "Emma Blackwood died 7 years ago." "No," Ezra said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 years of grief and a father's unshakable love. "She didn't die. You stole her. You took my little girl and tried to turn her into one of your victims. But she's stronger than you thought, isn't she? She found her way home." Annie appeared at the window then, supported by Ida May's strong arms. Even in the midst of labor, even after 7 years of brainwashing and abuse, she looked down at Ezra with eyes that held recognition and love. "I remember," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I remember the fishing trips and the bedtime stories and Mama's flower garden. I remember you teaching me to ride Princess, and I remember the last thing you said to me the morning I was taken." Her voice broke with emotion. "You said, 'Be brave, little sunshine. I'll see you after school.'" Ezra's own tears fell freely now, 30 years of military discipline unable to contain the overwhelming joy and rage that warred in his chest. "I've been waiting to see you after school for 7 years, Emma. Welcome home, baby girl." That's when the shooting started. Deputy Davidson drew his weapon first, the metallic sound of his service pistol clearing its holster, cutting through the Montana morning air like a death knell. But Ezra Blackwood hadn't survived 3 tours in Vietnam and countless dangerous missions as a Navy SEAL by hesitating when violence erupted. The moment he saw Davidson's hand move toward his gun, 30 years of combat instincts took over. The hunting rifle bucked against Ezra's shoulder as he fired, the shot echoing across the valley like thunder. Davidson spun and dropped, his weapon flying from his grasp as he clutched his shoulder and screamed in pain and rage. The other armed men scattered, seeking cover behind their vehicles while Francis Whitmore dove behind the porch railing, his carefully maintained composure shattered by the sudden explosion of violence. "FBI! Drop your weapons!" The shout came from multiple directions as federal agents emerged from positions around the ranch perimeter. Jake Morrison had been better than his word. While Ezra had been focused on protecting Emma and preparing for the confrontation, Jake had been quietly positioning a tactical team throughout the valley. But Whitmore's men weren't going down without a fight. Automatic weapons fire erupted from behind the black SUVs, bullets splintering the wooden porch posts and shattering windows throughout the ranch house. Ezra threw himself flat, military training overriding the 61-year-old body's protests as he army crawled toward better cover. From the bedroom window above, Emma's labor pains mixed with cries of terror as bullets whined overhead. Ida May's voice carried down the stairs, strong despite her 72 years. "Ezra, the baby's coming now. I can see the head." The juxtaposition was surreal and heartbreaking, new life entering the world while death raged just below. Ezra found himself caught between his desperate need to reach his daughter and the tactical reality that moving from cover would likely get him killed. The gunfight raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the crisp morning air filling with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sharp crack of splintering wood. Francis Whitmore, pinned behind inadequate cover with his carefully laid plans collapsing around him, made a decision that revealed the depth of his twisted psychology. If he couldn't have the baby he'd come to collect, he'd make sure no one could. The minister pulled a grenade from his jacket, military surplus from his collection of protection devices, and yanked the pin with the fervor of a man who believed he was serving God's will. "If I can't save her soul," he screamed, his voice cracking with religious mania, "then I'll send her to heaven myself." The explosion that followed was deafening. The concussion wave shattered every remaining window in the ranch house and threw Ezra against the porch wall hard enough to crack ribs. Splinters of wood and metal filled the air like deadly confetti, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the world went completely silent except for the ringing in everyone's ears. When the smoke cleared, Francis Whitmore was gone, vaporized by his own fanaticism. Two of his men lay motionless beside their destroyed vehicle, while a third crawled away trailing blood and broken bones. Deputy Davidson, despite his shoulder wound, had managed to drag himself to his patrol car and was attempting to radio for backup when Jake Morrison appeared beside him with handcuffs and a grim expression. But it was the sound from the bedroom that cut through all the chaos and carnage, the sharp, healthy cry of a newborn baby taking its first breath. Emma's daughter had chosen this moment of violence and destruction to enter the world, her voice rising above the gun smoke and debris like a declaration that life would triumph over death, that hope would prevail over evil. Ezra stumbled up the stairs, his body protesting every movement as he fought through pain and exhaustion to reach his daughter. He found Emma cradled in Ida May's arms, both women crying as they looked down at the tiny, perfect baby girl who lay screaming her defiance at the world that had tried to claim her before she was even born. "She's beautiful," Emma whispered, her voice weak but filled with wonder. "Papa, she's so beautiful." Ezra knelt beside the bed, his weathered hands trembling as he touched his granddaughter's tiny fingers. She was indeed beautiful, small but fierce, with Emma's green eyes and Sarah's delicate features. But more than her physical beauty was what she represented, the continuation of their family line despite 7 years of separation and trauma, proof that love could survive even the darkest evil. "What are you going to name her?" Ida May asked, tears streaming down her lined cheeks as she helped Emma settle more comfortably against the pillows. Emma looked up at her father, then down at her daughter, then back to Ezra with eyes that held both the innocence of the 8-year-old he'd lost and the wisdom of the 17-year-old woman she'd become. "Sarah Emma Blackwood," she said firmly. "After the grandmother she'll never meet, but who will always protect her, and after the little girl who had to die so this woman could be born." The FBI agents who flooded the ranch in the aftermath of the gunfight found a scene that would haunt many of them for years to come. Ezra Blackwood, wounded but unbowed, sat beside his daughter's bed holding his newborn granddaughter, while 3 generations of women, Emma, Ida May, and baby Sarah, formed a circle of love and protection that seemed untouchable despite the violence that surrounded them. Jake Morrison found Ezra an hour later after the scene had been secured and the wounded had been treated. His old friend looked older than his 61 years, gray-faced with exhaustion and pain, but his eyes held a light that Jake hadn't seen since before Emma's disappearance. "It's over," Jake said simply. "Whitmore's dead, Davidson's in custody, and we've rounded up the rest of the network. The babies who were sold, we're going to find them and reunite them with their families wherever possible." Ezra nodded, his attention still focused on the baby sleeping peacefully in his arms. "What about Emma? What about the legal issues with her identity, with everything that's happened?" "That's going to take time to sort out," Jake admitted. 7 years of brainwashing, false identity documents, the whole adoption fraud conspiracy, it's a legal nightmare. But Emma's fingerprints match the records from when she was 8, and DNA will confirm what we all already know. She's your daughter, Ezra. She's home. The afternoon sun slanted through the bullet-shattered windows, casting geometric patterns of light and shadow across the bedroom floor. Outside, FBI technicians processed evidence while paramedics treated the wounded and coroners dealt with the dead. But inside this small room, 3 generations of Blackwood women created their own sanctuary of peace and healing. Emma slept fitfully, her body exhausted from labor and trauma, but her spirit finally at rest for the first time in 7 years. Baby Sarah lay beside her, tiny fists clenched with the determination that would define her character, while Ida May dozed in the rocking chair that had once been Sarah's favorite spot for nursing Emma. Ezra remained awake, standing guard over his family with the vigilance of a man who'd learned too well that evil could strike without warning. But for the first time since that terrible morning 7 years ago, he allowed himself to believe that his nightmare was truly over. His daughter was home, his granddaughter was safe, and the family that had been shattered by violence and greed was finally whole again. The ranch would need extensive repairs, and the legal complexities would take months to resolve. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the sound of his daughter's breathing, the tiny movements of his granddaughter's sleeping form, and the knowledge that love had proven stronger than the darkest evil imaginable. The days following the gunfight brought a darkness that no amount of joy could fully dispel. While baby Sarah thrived in her first week of life, the cost of their victory became increasingly apparent with each passing hour. Mrs. Ida May Henderson, who had been like a grandmother to Emma and had delivered her baby with such strength and courage, suffered a massive heart attack 3 days after the confrontation. The stress of the violence, combined with her age and the emotional intensity of the reunion, proved too much for her 72-year-old heart. Ezra found her collapsed in the kitchen where she'd been preparing one of her famous apple pies for Emma, the same recipe she'd made countless times for Sarah years before. The paramedics worked frantically, but as they loaded her unconscious form into the ambulance, the lead medic's grim expression told Ezra everything he needed to know. Ida May's chances were slim, and even if she survived, she might never be the vibrant, nurturing presence they'd all come to depend on. Emma's reaction to the news was devastating. Already struggling with the overwhelming flood of recovered memories and the trauma of her 7-year ordeal, the thought of losing the woman who had become her anchor in those crucial first hours of freedom pushed her to the breaking point. She refused to eat, barely spoke, and spent hours staring out the window toward the hospital in Cedar Ridge where Ida May lay fighting for her life. "This is my fault," Emma whispered repeatedly, her voice hollow with guilt and exhaustion. "If I hadn't come here, if I hadn't brought this evil to your doorstep, she'd be fine. Everyone would be safe." The postpartum depression that might have been manageable under normal circumstances became a crushing weight when combined with survivor's guilt and the psychological aftermath of her captivity. Emma began to reject baby Sarah, unable to bond with the child who had been conceived through the horror of Graceland's breeding program. She couldn't look at her daughter without remembering the systematic abuse, the drugs, the other girls who hadn't been as fortunate as she was. "I don't know how to love her," Emma confessed to Ezra during one of their increasingly difficult conversations. "Every time I look at her, I remember what they did to me. I remember Mary Beth dying and the other girls who never got out. How can I love something that came from such evil?" Ezra found himself struggling with his own demons as well. The guilt of failing to protect Emma 7 years ago had returned with crushing force, complicated now by the knowledge that his moment of happiness had come at such a terrible cost. Deputy Davidson, despite his wounds, had managed to make several phone calls before his arrest, and the Blackwood Ranch was now marked by every corrupt official and criminal organization that had been part of Whitmore's network. The FBI protection detail that Jake Morrison had insisted upon was a constant reminder that their ordeal wasn't truly over. Armed agents patrolled the property day and night, while others monitored communications and investigated death threats that arrived with disturbing regularity. The ranch that had once been Ezra's sanctuary had become a fortress under siege, and the isolation that had once provided peace now felt like imprisonment. The financial cost was equally devastating. Medical bills from Emma's complicated delivery and ongoing therapy, combined with the extensive property damage from the gunfight, had drained Ezra's savings and forced him to consider selling parts of the ranch that had been in his family for generations. The cattle operation suffered as his attention focused on family crises, and several neighboring ranchers who had initially supported him began to distance themselves as the media attention brought unwanted scrutiny to their quiet valley. But perhaps the most heartbreaking development was Emma's deteriorating mental state. The recovered memories came in waves, each one bringing fresh trauma as she remembered not just her own suffering, but the fate of other children who had been taken by Whitmore's network. She spoke of girls who had died in childbirth, of babies who had been killed when they were born with disabilities that made them unsuitable for adoption, of the systematic dehumanization that had turned children into commodities. "There were so many of them, Papa," she would say during her worst moments, rocking back and forth as if the motion could somehow ease the psychological pain. "So many children who never made it home. Why was I the lucky one? Why did I get to survive when they didn't?" The weight of being the primary witness in what had become a massive federal investigation added another layer of stress. FBI agents needed detailed statements about everything Emma could remember from her 7 years at Graceland, forcing her to relive the worst experiences of her life over and over again for the sake of justice. As September turned to October, the joy of their reunion seemed increasingly overshadowed by the magnitude of their losses and the uncertain future that stretched ahead. Baby Sarah, innocent and beautiful, had become a symbol of both hope and despair, the continuation of their family line and the living reminder of unspeakable cruelty. The revelation that would change everything came from the most unexpected source, Mrs. Ida Mae Henderson herself, speaking from her hospital bed in what doctors feared might be her final hours. Ezra had been maintaining a vigil at her bedside, holding her frail hand while machines monitored her weakening heartbeat, when she suddenly gripped his fingers with surprising strength and pulled him closer. "Ezra?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the medical equipment's rhythmic beeping. "There's something I should have told you years ago, something about Sarah, about Emma, about who that child really is." The word sent a chill through Ezra's already shattered nerves. "What do you mean, Ida Mae? What about Sarah?" her rheumy eyes fixed on his with an intensity that seemed impossible given her condition. "Sarah was my daughter," she said, each word carefully measured despite her obvious pain. "My biological daughter. I gave her up for adoption when she was 3 days old back in 1955. I was 16, unmarried, and my father threatened to disown me if I kept her." The confession hit Ezra like a physical blow. He stared at the woman who had been his neighbor for over 20 years, who had comforted him through Sarah's death and Emma's disappearance, who had delivered his granddaughter just days before. "That's impossible. Sarah's adoption records showed her birth parents were from Colorado." "Falsified." Ida May breathed, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "The agency specialized in hiding inconvenient truths. I moved to this valley 30 years ago because I'd learned Sarah was living here. I wanted to be close to her, to watch over her from a distance." Her grip tightened again. "Emma isn't just your daughter, Ezra. She's my granddaughter. And that beautiful baby upstairs. She's my great-granddaughter." The implications crashed over Ezra in waves. Emma wasn't just a kidnapping victim who had miraculously found her way home. She was the last link in a family chain that stretched back generations, connecting her to the very woman who had risked everything to deliver her safely into the world. The cosmic justice of it seemed too profound to be coincidence. But Ida May wasn't finished with her revelations. As nurses bustled around them, adjusting medications and checking monitors, she continued her deathbed confession with the urgency of someone who knew time was running out. "Francis Whitmore," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word despite her failing body. "He wasn't just targeting random children, Ezra. He was specifically hunting bloodlines. Families with particular genetic traits that his wealthy clients were willing to pay premium prices for. Intelligence, artistic ability, physical characteristics." She paused, struggling for breath. "He took Emma because he'd been watching your family for months. Sarah's musical ability, your military record, Emma's test scores at school, you were all perfect specimens in his sick catalog." The revelation explained so much that had never made sense about Emma's kidnapping. Why she had been taken from school rather than snatched randomly off the street. Why the police investigation had been so quickly shut down despite multiple witness sightings. Why Deputy Davidson had been so invested in keeping the case cold. "There's more," Ida May continued, her medical monitors beginning to alarm as her vital signs fluctuated. "The other children in the network. They weren't random either. Whitmore had been tracking genealogies, medical records, school performance data. He was essentially running a eugenics program disguised as adoption services, breeding children like livestock, and selling them to buyers who wanted to guarantee their offspring's genetic advantages." As if summoned by the weight of these revelations, Jake Morrison appeared in the hospital room with a thick folder of documents and a grim expression that had become his permanent feature since the Graceland investigation began. He nodded respectfully to Ida May before turning to Ezra with news that would complete the picture of Whitmore's twisted operation. "We found his computer files," Jake said quietly. "Francis Whitmore had detailed genealogical charts going back 4 generations for every child in his network. Emma was specifically targeted because your family line showed consistent patterns of high intelligence, musical aptitude, and what he called superior physical development. He'd been planning her abduction for over a year." The folder Jake carried contained photographs and documents that painted a picture of systematic child hunting on a scale that dwarfed anything the FBI had previously encountered. Whitmore's organization had infiltrated school systems, medical facilities, and social services across 8 states, identifying children who met their clients' specifications, and then orchestrating their disappearances through carefully planned accidents and runaways. "Emma wasn't just lucky to escape," Jake continued, his voice heavy with the weight of what they'd discovered. She was the crown jewel of his entire operation. The baby she was carrying had already been sold for $200,000 to a couple in Switzerland who specifically requested a child with her exact genetic profile. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As Jake spread the documents across the hospital room's small table, a photograph fell out that made Ida May gasp with recognition. It showed Francis Whitmore as a young man, standing beside a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Sarah Blackwood. "That's my sister," Ida May whispered, her voice filled with horror. "My sister Margaret, who died in a car accident 20 years ago. Francis Whitmore was her son, my nephew. He knew exactly who Emma was when he took her. He knew she was family." The family connection explained the personal hatred that had driven Whitmore to such extremes. According to the documents Jake had uncovered, Margaret Henderson had died while trying to expose an illegal adoption ring that had been operating in Colorado, the same organization that had eventually evolved into Graceland Children's Haven under her son's leadership. "He blamed your family for his mother's death," Jake explained to the stunned room. In his mind, Margaret died because she was trying to reunite adopted children with their birth families. When he learned that Emma was connected to the Henderson bloodline through Sarah, it became a personal vendetta disguised as religious mission. The twisted logic of a madman began to make horrific sense. Whitmore hadn't just been running a profit-driven trafficking operation. He'd been conducting a campaign of personal revenge against the family he held responsible for his mother's death, while simultaneously trying to perfect the genetic lines he believed had been corrupted by poverty and inadequate parenting. Emma's 7 years of captivity took on an even darker dimension when viewed through this lens. She hadn't just been brainwashed and abused, she'd been specifically tortured by a man who saw her as the embodiment of everything wrong with his mother's idealistic crusade for family reunification. Every day of her suffering had been both business transaction and personal satisfaction for Francis Whitmore. The documents also revealed the fate of other children who had been less fortunate than Emma. Photographs and medical records showed dozens of young people who had died in Graceland's custody, either from complications during forced pregnancies or from what Whitmore's notes coldly described as genetic disappointments that made them unsuitable for his client base. As the full scope of the horror became clear, Ida May's medical monitors began to sound increasingly urgent alarms. The stress of her revelations, combined with her already fragile condition, was taking its final toll. Nurses rushed into the room as her blood pressure dropped precipitously and her heart rhythm became erratic. "Tell Emma," she gasped as medical personnel worked frantically around her. "Tell her she's not alone. Tell her she comes from a line of strong women who fought for what was right. Tell her that baby represents hope, not horror. She's the future we all fought to protect." With those words, Mrs. Ida May Henderson closed her eyes for the last time, taking with her 72 years of secrets, sacrifices, and unconditional love. Her death certificate would list heart failure as the cause, but Ezra knew the truth. She had died from the weight of loving too much and fighting too hard for the family she had never been allowed to claim openly. The woman who had delivered Emma's baby, who had been a surrogate grandmother for 7 years of separation, who had provided the final pieces of a puzzle that stretched back generations, was gone. But her legacy lived on in the 3 generations of women who would carry forward the Henderson strength, the Blackwood determination, and the unbreakable bonds of love that even Francis Whitmore's evil had been unable to destroy. The funeral of Mrs. Ida May Henderson took place on a crisp October morning when the Montana sky stretched endlessly blue above the Sweetwater Valley. Nearly every ranching family within 50 miles attended, their presence a testament to the quiet strength of a woman who had touched countless lives through 7 decades of selfless service to her community. Emma, still weak from childbirth and struggling with the overwhelming revelations about her family's history, insisted on attending despite Ezra's concerns about her fragile emotional state. As the simple wooden casket was lowered into the earth beside the small cemetery's weathered headstones, Emma held baby Sarah close to her chest, finally beginning to understand the profound connections that bound their family together across generations. The child who had seemed like a burden born of horror was actually the culmination of a love story that stretched back nearly 70 years, connecting great-grandmother to great-granddaughter through bonds that evil had tried but failed to break. "She never got to hold her," Emma whispered to Ezra as dirt began to fill the grave. "Ida May delivered Sarah and saved both our lives, but she never got to hold her great-granddaughter." The grief that followed Mrs. Henderson's death became a catalyst for healing rather than destruction. Something about losing the woman who had been their anchor forced Emma to confront the choice between honoring Ida May's sacrifice or surrendering to the trauma that threatened to consume her. 3 days after the funeral, Emma appeared in the kitchen where Ezra was struggling to prepare breakfast for them both and wordlessly took baby Sarah from his arms. "Ida May told me something before she died," Emma said quietly, settling into the rocking chair that had been Sarah's favorite spot for nursing. "She said this baby represents hope, not horror. She said I come from a line of strong women who fought for what was right." Emma looked down at her daughter's perfect features, seeing for the first time not the circumstances of her conception, but the miracle of her existence. "I want to be strong like that. I want to be worthy of the sacrifices that brought us all home." The bonding that followed was tentative at first, marked by tears and setbacks, as Emma worked through 7 years of psychological conditioning that had taught her to view herself as worthless. But with each day that passed, the connection between mother and daughter grew stronger. Baby Sarah seemed to sense the change in her mother's emotional state, becoming less fussy and more responsive to Emma's touch and voice. Ezra watched this transformation with a mixture of profound relief and protective vigilance. His daughter was healing, but the process was fragile and could be disrupted by any number of external pressures. The media attention surrounding the Graceland case had turned their ranch into a circus, with reporters camping outside the gates and helicopters circling overhead at all hours. Death threats continued to arrive in the mail, and the FBI protection detail remained a constant reminder that their safety was far from guaranteed. The legal proceedings that followed Francis Whitmore's death began to reveal the full scope of his criminal enterprise. Jake Morrison's investigation had uncovered 312 children who had been trafficked through the Graceland network over 15 years, with profits exceeding $23 million. The corrupt officials who had protected the operation faced federal charges, while the wealthy families who had purchased children through the network found themselves under intense scrutiny. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the legal aftermath was the question of what to do about the children who had been sold to families who genuinely believed they were participating in legitimate adoptions. Emma's testimony before a federal grand jury revealed that many of the adoptive parents had been deceived about the children's origins, told that they were orphans or surrendered by birth mothers who couldn't care for them. Some of those families really loved the children they adopted, Emma told the prosecutors during one of her many debriefing sessions. They didn't know where the babies really came from. Separating children from the only parents they've ever known, that would just create more victims. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on Emma as she prepared to testify before a Senate committee investigating adoption fraud nationwide. Her story had become the face of the Graceland scandal, and lawmakers were looking to her for guidance on how to prevent similar tragedies while protecting the children who had already been placed with adoptive families. The decision to go to Washington, D.C. for the congressional hearings represented a major milestone in Emma's recovery. 3 months after giving birth and losing Mrs. Henderson, she felt strong enough to leave the ranch for the first time since her escape from Graceland. Baby Sarah would accompany her, along with Ezra and a security detail that reflected the ongoing threats against their family. The hearing room was packed with media, advocates, and families affected by adoption fraud when Emma took the witness stand. 18 years old now, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke to the Henderson strength Mrs. Henderson had recognized in her. Baby Sarah slept peacefully in a carrier beside the witness table, her presence serving as a powerful reminder of what was at stake in the fight against child trafficking. "My name is Emma Blackwood," she began, her voice clear and steady despite the intensity of the moment. "7 years ago, I was kidnapped from my school playground and spent the next 7 years being systematically abused by people who claimed to be saving children. I was told my parents were dead, given a new identity, and ultimately forced into what Francis Whitmore called his breeding program." The testimony that followed was devastating in its clarity and compassion. Emma described the horrors of Graceland while also acknowledging the complex realities faced by adoptive families who had unknowingly participated in the trafficking network. She called for stronger oversight of adoption agencies, better protection for birth mothers, and support systems for trafficking survivors. "The baby sleeping beside me," Emma said, gesturing toward Sarah, "was supposed to be sold for $200,000 to a family in Switzerland. But she's not a commodity to be bought and sold. She's a human being with the right to know where she came from and to be raised by people who love her unconditionally." The impact of her testimony was immediate and profound. Within weeks of the hearing, Congress passed the most comprehensive adoption reform legislation in American history, establishing federal oversight of international adoptions and creating strict penalties for agencies that engaged in fraudulent practices. But for Emma, the real victory came in the personal transformation that speaking publicly about her experiences had triggered. Standing up before the world's media and telling her story without shame or self-blame marked the final stage of her psychological healing. She was no longer a victim hiding from her past, but a survivor determined to help others find their way home. The return to Montana brought unexpected news that would complete their family's healing journey. Jake Morrison arrived at the ranch with documents that had been discovered in Francis Whitmore's personal safe, including detailed records of every child who had passed through his network. Among those records was information about Emma's original kidnapping that had never been shared with local law enforcement. "He kept trophies," Jake explained as he spread the documents across the kitchen table where Emma and Ezra had shared so many difficult conversations. Photographs, personal items, detailed notes about each child's personality and abilities. It's sick, but it's also evidence that's going to help us locate dozens of other victims. One of the photographs showed 8-year-old Emma on her last day of freedom, walking toward the school entrance with her backpack slung over her shoulder and her hair in the pigtails that Sarah used to braid for her each morning. But it was the notation on the back of the photograph that brought tears to both Emma's and Ezra's eyes. "Perfect specimen. Mother's musical ability confirmed. Father's military discipline evident. Estimated value, $150,000. He saw us as merchandise," Emma said quietly, studying the cold calculation in Whitmore's handwriting. "But he was wrong. We're not valuable because of our genetics or our abilities. We're valuable because we're loved." As winter settled over the Sweetwater Valley, the Blackwood Ranch began to feel like home again for the first time in 7 years. The FBI protection detail had been reduced to periodic check-ins. The media attention had shifted to other stories, and the immediate threats against their family had diminished as Whitmore's network was systematically dismantled. Emma had made the decision to complete her high school education through correspondence courses, planning to attend college the following fall with a focus on social work and victim advocacy. Baby Sarah was thriving, her bright eyes and infectious smile bringing joy to a household that had known too much sorrow. Most importantly, the 3 generations of women in the house had found their rhythm together. Emma was growing into her role as a mother with the support of the great-grandmother's wisdom that Mrs. Henderson had passed down through stories and traditions. Ezra was learning to be a grandfather while still honoring his role as Emma's father, and baby Sarah was growing up surrounded by the kind of unconditional love that Frances Whitmore had tried to destroy, but could never truly extinguish. The first Christmas together in 7 years arrived like a gift wrapped in Montana snow and tied with ribbons of hope. Emma sat in the rocking chair that had once been her mother's favorite, nursing baby Sarah, while watching Ezra string lights on the same Douglas fir tree they'd cut from their own land every December since she was small. The familiar ritual felt both achingly nostalgic and beautifully new, as if they were rediscovering traditions that had been waiting patiently for their return. "Do you remember," Ezra said quietly, adjusting an ornament that Emma had made in 2nd grade, a popsicle stick angel with cotton ball wings, "how your mama used to insist we sing Silent Night before we opened any presents?" His voice carried the weight of 7 Christmases spent alone, decorating trees for an empty house and singing lullabies to photographs. Emma smiled, her memories still fragmented but growing stronger each day. "I remember her voice," she said, shifting baby Sarah to her shoulder for burping. "She used to hum while she wrapped presents, and she always hid one special gift that we'd only find days later." The recollection came with a bittersweet pang. So many recovered memories were tinged with the knowledge of everything they'd lost. The house itself seemed to exhale with contentment as they prepared for their quiet celebration. The bullet holes from the September confrontation had been repaired, the shattered windows replaced, and Mrs. Henderson's apple pie recipe had been successfully recreated after several failed attempts. Emma had insisted on learning to make the pies herself, determined to carry forward the traditions of the great-grandmother she'd barely known, but whose love had shaped her rescue. 6 months pregnant when she'd first arrived at the ranch, Emma was now a confident mother whose natural instincts had finally overcome the psychological conditioning of her captivity. Baby Sarah, at 3 months old, was a chubby, happy infant who seemed to radiate joy despite the traumatic circumstances of her birth. She had Emma's green eyes and Ezra's strong jaw, but her smile was pure Sarah Blackwood, the kind of illuminating grin that could light up a room and heal hearts that had forgotten how to hope. The legal aftermath of the Graceland case had finally concluded with the conviction of 47 individuals across 8 states. The civil lawsuit had resulted in a settlement that would ensure Emma and Sarah's financial security, but more importantly, it had led to the rescue of 89 other children and the establishment of new federal protocols for investigating adoption fraud. Emma's testimony had become a cornerstone of congressional hearings that had reformed adoption law nationwide. "I got a letter from one of the other girls today," Emma said, opening an envelope that had arrived with the morning mail. "Jennifer Sullivan. She was at Graceland when I was there. She's getting married next month to a man who doesn't care about her past, only about their future together." The letter was one of many that arrived regularly, connecting Emma to a network of survivors who were rebuilding their lives with the strength that came from shared experience and mutual support. The community response to their story had been overwhelming. Neighboring ranchers had contributed labor and materials to repair the property damage, while churches across Montana had organized fundraisers to support other trafficking victims. The ranch had become an unofficial symbol of hope for families dealing with missing children, and Emma had quietly begun corresponding with parents whose cases shared similarities with her own experience. Jake Morrison visited regularly, bringing updates on the ongoing investigation and occasionally staying for dinner like the family friend he'd become. His latest news was particularly encouraging. The international cooperation sparked by the Graceland case had led to the discovery of similar networks in 12 countries, with hundreds of children being reunited with their birth families. The Swiss couple who'd paid for Sarah, Jake told them over Christmas Eve dinner, they've become major advocates for adoption reform in Europe. They said meeting you changed their understanding of what ethical adoption really means. The couple had also established a foundation supporting trafficking survivors, with Emma serving as an honorary board member despite her age. But perhaps the most meaningful development had been Emma's decision to reach out to other young mothers in their valley who were struggling with isolation and postpartum challenges. Every Thursday afternoon, their kitchen became an informal support group where women shared stories, exchanged childcare tips, and reminded each other that they weren't alone in their struggles. Mrs. Henderson would have loved this, Emma said, watching 5 young mothers chat while their children played safely nearby. She always said the strongest communities were built one friendship at a time. The weekly gatherings had become legendary in Sweetwater Valley, with grandmothers volunteering to help with childcare and local businesses donating supplies for new mothers. Ezra had found his own form of healing through mentoring other fathers whose children had gone missing. His military background and hard-won wisdom about never giving up hope made him a natural counselor for families navigating the nightmare of child abduction. He'd helped organize search efforts for 3 missing children in the past 6 months, and his calm presence had become a source of strength for parents whose worlds had been shattered by loss. The ranch operation had not only recovered, but expanded, with Ezra hiring 2 young veterans who needed work and purpose. The cattle herd was thriving, and they'd added organic farming operations that supplied vegetables to restaurants in Cedar Ridge. The land that had once felt empty and purposeless was now bustling with activity and hope. As Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, Emma found herself standing in the doorway of what had once been her childhood bedroom, now converted into a nursery for Sarah. The mobile above the crib played "You Are My Sunshine," the same melody that had triggered her first recovered memories. But now the song carried only joy. A lullaby that connected 4 generations of women who had loved and been loved despite every obstacle. "Merry Christmas, Mama," Emma whispered to the framed photograph of Sarah Blackwood that held a place of honor on the nursery dresser. "We made it home." Baby Sarah stirred in her crib, opening her bright eyes and offering the kind of toothless smile that made every hardship worthwhile. As Emma lifted her daughter into her arms, she felt the presence of all the women who had fought to make this moment possible. Her mother, Sarah, who had loved her unconditionally, Mrs. Henderson, who had sacrificed everything to bring her home, and all the survivors who continued to rebuild their lives with courage and determination. The sound of Ezra making coffee in the kitchen below mixed with the gentle whisper of snow against the windows, creating a symphony of ordinary domestic happiness that felt extraordinary after everything they'd endured. This was what victory looked like. Not dramatic gestures or public recognition, but quiet moments of love shared between family members who refused to let evil have the final word. As they gathered around the Christmas tree that morning, 3 generations connected by bonds stronger than blood, Emma realized that their story wasn't really about the horror they'd survived, but about the love that had brought them through it. Baby Sarah would grow up knowing that she was wanted, treasured, and protected by a family that had moved heaven and earth to be together. The gifts under the tree were simple, handmade items and practical necessities. But the real present was the gift of time stretching ahead of them, filled with birthdays and holidays, scraped knees and school plays, teenage dramas and college graduations, all the ordinary milestones that make up a life lived in freedom and surrounded by love. "What do you wish for, Emma?" Ezra asked, as they sat surrounded by wrapping paper and contentment. Emma looked at her father, then down at her daughter, then around the room that held so many memories of pain transformed into joy. "I don't need to wish any more, Papa," she said simply. "I have everything I ever wanted. I'm home." Message for American seniors, 200 words. If you're between 55 and 68, you understand that the most precious gifts in life aren't things, they're the people we love and the time we have together. Emma Blackwood's story reminds us that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the bonds we choose to honor and the love we refuse to let go of, even when darkness threatens to overwhelm us. Like Ezra, many of us have experienced seasons of loss that felt impossible to survive. We've sat at kitchen tables talking to photographs, wondering if joy would ever return to our homes. We've questioned whether our sacrifices mattered, whether our love was enough. Emma's journey home teaches us that persistence in love, even when hope seems foolish, can literally move mountains. At this stage of our lives, we're often the anchors for younger generations facing their own storms. We're the Ezras and Mrs. Hendersons, offering wisdom, stability, and unconditional love when the world feels chaotic. This Christmas season, remember that your presence in someone's life might be the difference between them giving up and finding their way home. Love doesn't have an expiration date, and it's never too late for a miracle. Discussion questions. Have you ever been the Ezra in someone's story? The steady presence that helped them through their darkest time? What traditions from your own family do you hope will continue through the generations, and how are you passing them on? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories of resilience and love matter and inspire others in our community.